Who are you talking about? Oh.
All right. All right, Skye, we are live. How are you?
I'm good. The story turned out great.
Yeah, I thought it really put perspective on it, and we thank you guys for sharing those stories with us. What have you heard? Because we don't often get to go inside and really see a group like that. And you share your story a lot, but that was a little different way for you to share your story. So talk about why you share your story. I think that's a good starting point for us.
So I started sharing my story because I thought that people kept telling me that I didn't look like a heroin addict, and I thought that that was interesting. That that people thought that somehow we all looked the same. That also played into me not getting treatment right away, and there not being interventions that helped me earlier in my addiction. So I think that it's really important for me now to continue to take ownership of my recovery and to be proud of it and share it with others.
You've been in recovery for how many years now?
So it's over 12 years now.
And talk to me about what a heroin addict looks like. Are we getting away from those stereotypes? Because a lot of people still think the 70s and people sticking needles in their arms on a dirty street. What do you deal with as far as that goes?
So, I mean, a heroin addict looks like anybody. Substance abuse is one of those diseases that doesn't discriminate. It's all races, it's all ethnicities, it's all genders, sexual orientation. There is no discrimination. So, and a heroin addict can look like anybody.
And I think what we learn in this, there's a couple things we learn, but talk about the pain aspect. I think a lot of parents watching, especially, a lot of teenagers go through emotions, but pain, you talked to me about that, and that was eye-opening to me.
Yeah, so the longer I've been in this field, the more I understand that the link between pain and addiction. So sometimes it's physical pain, right? Opiates and opioids are really good for treating physical pain, but then even beyond physical pain, there's so much emotional pain, childhood trauma, abuse and neglect. There's so many different things that can cause that emotional pain that also people are seeking some way to medicate themselves.
And these are young people across the board. We actually looked at the numbers tonight, and you saw that in the story, but you see the faces, and I think it is shocking to somebody who might not put faces with numbers.
And I apologize, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
If I move the mic, is that a little
there
better?
We go. That's much better.
That's probably. I was saying that we saw faces tonight, and I think that's a little different than just hearing about numbers. You hear young people that have an addiction problem, but we actually saw faces tonight, and those are young faces, and that's who you deal with every day. And so talk about the age group this is affecting.
So because of the skyrocketing prescriptions for OxyContin mainly, about 10, 15 years ago, we saw this huge number of people become dependent on prescription painkillers. And then when we worked to make those medications less abusable, unfortunately that left a lot of people that were already dependent on opioids with an addiction and not the treatment in order to get better. And so many of them turned to heroin at that time. So the biggest demographics that we have at our clinic right now are people 35 and under who are addicted to opiates.
And you take a second to think about that. We have a pill-addicted society. We have so many people using pills. We have parents who just tell their kids, go take a pill and it'll get better. And so if we take away a message just listening to these stories from really young people tonight, they were turning to pills basically to numb some pain.
They were turning to pills. I apologize. I missed the last part of your question.
You talked about pain before. They're turning to pills in many cases to numb pain, and that in some cases leads to heroin.
Yeah, absolutely. The longer that we can delay people in using that first time, the more protection that we can give them. So it's really important for people to understand the dangers of kids having access to pain medication or being prescribed pain medication.
We had a question online, and you've probably been watching these through the day. I'm going to read some of them to you, though. Sarah asks us, she says, I know the physical addiction goes away relatively quickly. When does the mental addiction go away?
So the research tells us that it takes about 2 years for someone who has been dependent on an opiate or opioid in order for their brain to go back to normal and for them to experience happiness the same way that other people do. That doesn't mean that they're no longer an addict. Unfortunately, addiction isn't something that's curable. We go into remission or recovery, as we call it, instead of, we're just fixed and we don't ever have to worry about that again. But after 2 years, our brains do start to function more similarly to people that haven't struggled with an addiction.
I was about to ask you the importance, and you sort of answered it there, but a recovering addict, that's the common term used. Why is that such an important term?
So, I think that there's so much stigma towards people that struggle with addiction that we really need to show people that just because somebody struggled with addiction, we're not a junkie. We don't fit that model. There are tons of people that are living in recovery, and the 12-step community has done so much right for our community. And the one thing that I think that maybe that we got a little bit wrong there is the anonymity, because a lot of people that are doing really well and living in recovery are anonymous about it. And so, unfortunately, what you hear about when you hear about addiction is people who are actively in addiction instead of those of us who are in recovery, who are living and thriving and important parts of your community.
What you were reading the questions today, did anything stand out to you that you saw asked?
Yeah, so there was a couple of comments on there about if you're stupid enough to do it, right, you deserve what you get, and unfortunately that's a pretty prevalent idea in our society. And I really hope that, by more and more of us in recovery sharing our stories, that we can take some of that away from people. Because we're not the enemy, right? Nobody wants to live in active addiction. It's a miserable place to live. So to be able to show people that, that we're not the enemy, that we're also just trying to get better, and that there's lots of different reasons that people use for the first time, and there's lots of different reasons that cause addiction. Unfortunately, it's a pretty complicated picture, and to just rush to those snap judgments isn't a fair way of looking at a whole person.
I've heard a story of an athlete who just hurt himself during practice. He starts using painkillers to just stop the pain, and then suddenly he's on heroin. You hear stories like that every day. A kid who probably had good grades and is going through athletics at school and then becomes a heroin addict.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, athletes are more likely to get hurt, and people that get hurt are more likely to be prescribed prescription pain medication. We're doing a lot in Dane County to reduce the number of opioid-based pain medications that we're giving out, but it's still a problem. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of people that are, varsity for their different sporting events have a really serious injury, and then because of their genetics and their life experience, when they start taking that prescription medication, it turns into an addiction and they can't stop.
That wall has to be tough. You have that remembrance wall inside Connections. It has to be tough to see that every day, to reminder of the very few. You don't lose that many. You were talking to me about how you love your job and most days you get to help people, but it has to be very tough to see that.
It is. It's the hardest part of the job by far. It's the tragedy that is involved in my work, and it never gets any easier. But I think that it's really important for us as a staff and also for all of the clients who come to Connections to remember that this is a life or death disease. This isn't something that we can stop paying attention to, or if life gets busy, we put other things first. Recovery has to be a priority because this is something that could kill you.
Any other questions in regards to that you've heard, maybe through Facebook or just from people in general, some common questions that you get that you think would be a good educator for folks watching?
So I think that often the comments that I get from people, I do a lot of community presentations, and what people usually ask is why, and that's different for each person. I can't put that into some 2-second answer because it's for that particular person and their life experience. Another thing that comes up a lot is just resources in the community. There's, unfortunately, there is a lack of resources. I work in an underfunded system. It's been underfunded for a long time. So people are always, if they have somebody that they care about who has tried to get help and has struggled to get help. People ask a lot of questions about that. I would recommend very highly that people who are looking for resources look for the Parent Addiction Network. It's a web page that's run by a group of parent volunteers who have children who've struggled with addiction. They keep an up-to-date list of treatment resources, what insurances each type of treatment takes. There's a list of sober living homes and halfway houses. It's an amazing site. These parents have put a lot of effort into it. And for people who are looking for resources, that's a great first step.
And when we talked about the recovery process, you mentioned to me, and we quickly mentioned in the story, the insurance part, and you mentioned it there again to me. Mm-hmm. How does that create a barrier for people trying to get into recovery?
So when people decide that they're ready to get sober, it's a very short window that we have. And unfortunately, the way that our system in Madison is set up, different insurers, different funders allow you to go to different treatment centers. You need an assessment, and then you can move forward with treatment from there. But sometimes, it's a difficult system to navigate. So people call their insurer, find out that they can go to this one place, but that was out of date information, so now they have to try this other place, or they call a clinic to get some type of assistance, but the clinic only does one kind of therapy, and that type of therapy doesn't work for them. So it gets really complicated with trying to figure out who goes where and how we get them there as quickly as possible, because we don't have a lot of time to get these people the help that they need.
Does that create some sort of loophole? Do you hear from folks who want help one day, and then because it took too long, they're suddenly not wanting help anymore, they're back into active addiction?
That window is so short, and so we have to move then, and if we don't, who knows the next time that they're going to be ready. Maybe it's next week, maybe it's next year. We don't know.
There's an interesting question from Amber, and she says, were you properly educated about drugs? And I remember I was of the generation that went through the DARE program. Mm-hmm. Were you properly educated about drugs?
So I also went through the DARE program. The evidence shows that education is not effective in prevention or in treating addiction. There's actually some evidence that shows that people who are well educated about drugs are actually more likely to use them. Unfortunately, that's not the solution. I wish it was that easy. I wish we could just, give people good information, and that would be enough to drive people's motivation to not use or to stop using. But it doesn't seem to work like that. It seems to work better if we focus on people's motivation, about what drives people to get clean and stay clean, and then if we focus on what makes people happy, what makes us a happy and well community, is the best way to prevent addiction.
I'm going to pause for a second, see if we have anybody watching that wants to ask a question of you. Alan's with us. What'd you think of the story, Alan?
I thought it was good. It was better than I expected.
Well, that's good. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah, it's been a good job.
Your story, you've been in recovery almost 4 years now. So you say the beginning was hard. Take me through the mindset of what hard means.
Um, well, wow, I didn't think I was gonna get put on watching. Um, I think the hardest part was just doing a lot of stuff uncomfortable for me. Making new friends was probably the biggest, both the most important thing for me and also the hardest. It was like I really had to connect with people that were in recovery and that were positive influences instead of the people that I kind of were around in the past that were that were negatively influencing me, and that I was probably negatively influencing them as well.
Skye, what is that the common story you hear, negative influences and creating positive influences when they come into connections?
Absolutely. Social support networks are so important. We do have a tendency to, engage in the same behaviors as our social support network. So when people are actively using the social support network around youth, it revolves around recovery, and the recovery community is a pretty strong and amazing place. So fortunately, Alan and I get to be a part of that.
And I didn't have time to put this in the story, but you talk about the friend network that drugs draw people toward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it does seem like, drugs come with ready-made friendships. All you have to do is use with somebody, and, automatically you're just friends. So part of recovery is learning how to make friendships without using, and that is challenging and awkward at first.
How do you keep people from going back, getting over that awkward stage? Maybe Alan can help us out with that too.
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
You said at first it's awkward to move into recovery. How do you get past that?
Walk towards the awkwardness. Recovery isn't a comfortable journey. No matter how skilled I ever am at this job, I'm never going to be able to make it comfortable for people, because what's comfortable is continuing to use. Recovery is always going to be uncomfortable, but it's worth it. So walk towards the discomfort, face it, learn how to cope with it, and life does get better.
What misconceptions? We heard a lot about stigma when I was just actually observing the group that day.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have too much time to talk about that, but that is a big, important part of why you all meet as a group, to help each other deal with the stigma. What stigma exists with heroin use?
I mean, I think that, lazy, stupid, uh, you know, toxic, criminal. There's, when you think of a heroin addict, you like your mind goes to that place that you see in movies, of those awful people, and that's not who we are. Alan, what do you think?
What was the question?
What are some of the stigmas?
Um, I think you said a lot of them. One thing that comes to mind is like dirty, unsanitary, disease-ridden, maybe. I think homelessness a lot of the time is associated with that. This is talked about a lot, but I think a lot, even for myself, the before I kind of got into recovery and learned more about addiction and kind of what I was experiencing, I had this image of a person that, that was a drug addict that was like under a bridge, clutching a brown bag and drinking booze and, in like a really dirty situation. And I think that's partially what made it harder for me to accept the fact that I had an issue with drugs and alcohol. and I was almost stigmatizing myself.
Yeah, I think by just observing your group, people say this could be anybody you interact with. Skye, did I lose you?
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing. It sounded like something else was happening there.
The stigma that goes along with this is really, it could be anybody, though. It's not somebody under a bridge. It's actually anybody you can interact with on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Yeah, you never know who's struggling. So it could be absolutely anybody. And that idea of somebody living under a bridge, I'm sure that there are some people that are addicted to heroin that are living under bridges, and no disrespect to them, but it's not the majority of us.
So in your group, we saw Alan, you're an IT specialist, and then we saw two other people, a chef, a farmer. Who else do you see?
Anybody. So we've had lawyers, we've had doctors, nurses, right, Alan? I mean, it's anybody. Sometimes people that are unemployed, sometimes people that are brilliant. I mean, it doesn't discriminate.
We call this a disease. What is the disease process? Help people understand that.
So the DSM classifies us as a disease. Alan, do you know the year?
What year DSM?
Yeah.
Oh,
I think it was
was
classified as a disease.
the 50s, maybe?
Okay. Yeah. 50s or 60s. Yeah, it's been classified as a disease for a long time. So a disease, the disease of addiction is chronic, which means that it's long-lasting. It's not an acute disease. So it's not like when you break your leg and you go and get treatment and then your leg is okay. It follows a progression more similar to diabetes, where you can manage it, and there's things that you can do to stay healthy, but that you have diabetes or you don't have diabetes, you have an addiction or you don't have an addiction. Another important part for people to understand is the progression of the disease. So the more you use, the worse the disease gets. So, just like somebody who had diabetes who wasn't taking care of their blood sugar, they would have more and more serious responses to that over time. Same goes for us, that if we continue to use, if we continue to engage in behavior that's harmful to us, then the more serious the impacts on our body and on our brain.
And the brain chemistry too, it changes. You introduce pills at first in a lot of cases into the body, and then I went into it in a bigger picture way, but talk about the endorphins that it creates, a little more of the technical part of how this works.
Yeah, so all psychoactive substances mimic some type of neurotransmitter that you have naturally in your brain. So heroin impacts the endorphin system and also the dopamine system the most. When you start to use and you introduce that chemical into your brain, it actually changes the way that, and this is going to get complicated, I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So we all have receptor sites in our brain that those chemicals bond to. And when you're using a substance that's different from your natural neurotransmitters, it actually changes the shape of your receptor sites. So the reason that it takes someone who's addicted to opiates, it takes their brain 2 years to heal, is because that's how long it takes for the receptor sites on their brain to start fitting their natural neurotransmitters the same way again. That was a little bit complicated.
So if you're looking at the brain, we saw a cartoon kind of in the story, and if you're looking at the brain, it's sending all this stuff in there, and it's overloading it, and that stuff sticks around for a couple of years, is what you're saying.
So the stuff doesn't stick around, but if you think of it as a lock and key. So the lock is your receptor site, and the key is the neurotransmitter. When you use a different shape of key, after a while it actually changes the lock. So the lock now fits your other kind of key better than the first key. So your brain has to take some time to heal itself in order to be able to bond to the natural neurotransmitter the same way that it has been to the one that you introduced.
When we were talking, I think you described it well. You said the addict's brain, it's almost like they can't live without the drug, like we can't live without food.
Absolutely. So the way that what we know is that when somebody can't breathe or is starving or needs water, that they stop being able to care about, whether or not they're in love or what college they're going to go to or what career they're in. All of those things stop mattering because all that matters is surviving. And we know that when we put laboratory mice or rats into an experiment where they're given a choice between drugs and their substance, before they're in active addiction, they'll choose both. But when they're in active addiction, they'll choose the drug to the point where they starve themselves to death and they die. So in a brain that's actively addicted, our brains tell us that our drug is more important than food, than water. It doesn't tell us that it's more important than breathing because that's a really immediate need, but anything else.
Yeah, Michelle is off the desk now.
Hi.
Michelle.
Hi.
How's it going? It looks like you've had quite a few viewers in here, and I've been looking at some of the Facebook responses. I think these are just good to know. Like Tanya says, as a recovering addict in the community myself, I really admire those speaking out and those giving us the opportunity to have a voice. It is truly a heartbreaking disease that needs to have more attention given to it. The topic is extremely taboo, which is in a big way is a huge part of the issue of the epidemic. So I think that's great that that you're here with us and sharing your story.
No, thank you.
Someone, Jamie Lee, wants to know, and maybe you've answered this already, have you gone through a lot of Facebook questions? Because I can stop. But Jamie Lee wanted to know, what is the #1 long-term thing that has kept you clean?
I mean, I think that the key to long-term recovery is happiness. If you build a life where you're happy and fulfilled and you have some type of purpose, you stay sober. When you don't, when you're white-knuckling it or just trying to get through to that next day, everybody's just trying to get through to the next day at the beginning. But over time, people that build happy lives for themselves are the ones that stay sober.
Sarah wanted to know, when does the mental addiction go away? And maybe you've addressed that, because I kind of jumped in when you said 2 years,
Yeah.
but I didn't know if that changes with the physical addiction, because she said, I know the physical addiction goes away, but when does the mental addiction go away?
We did touch on that a bit. So, it does take 2 years for a person's brain to heal following the end of their use. But then, just because your brain is healed doesn't mean that you no longer have an addiction. You do, it's just in remission.
And then I just have another question, too. This is from Amanda, who looks like she has a family member maybe in prison. I'm not reading this. I'm reading this really quickly, or maybe in and out of prison. But she says, I'm wondering when or what amount of dignity or tragedy it takes for an addict to finally get clean. I have a family member who's been an addict for at least a decade. My father's elderly and has tried to help him for years to no avail. How many felonies? How much jail time? How much of the lives of those who you love and love you has to be thrown away? He has to help himself, but I love him and pray every day for his sobriety.
Yeah.
Any advice for her? That's Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a tragic situation, and unfortunately one we hear too often. What I will say is that it's always both. So it's always push and it's always pull into recovery. It sounds like, Amanda's loved one has had lots of things that have pushed him into recovery. Jail time, arrests, all of the things that have been pushing him in, all of those consequences that he's faced. But it doesn't sound like there's all that much pulling him into recovery. So, having that support system, having people in his life that understand his addiction and that care about him, it's a really huge piece of it. What I would say to any family member or person that's impacted by recovery who wants to help somebody in their life is the best thing that they can do is go to Al-Anon meetings or Nar-Anon meetings, Families Anonymous. We actually have a free family support group at Connections that meets every Monday night at 6 o'clock. So there's lots of resources for people who are impacted by somebody else's addiction, and them working through their own process and understanding it better will help their loved one more than anything else could.
And maybe you've touched on this too, I'm sorry, but following up with that, if you have a loved one, Brenda says, there are a lot of programs out there. We have an epidemic, but we still have a lot of mountains to climb. She says her son is 25. However, it was her who was the one standing up and digging in, looking for the most successful programs that he would be using. But she found it very difficult to get anywhere since he's an adult. And she said her experience is that it was about HIPAA laws.
So that's very true. Substance abuse records are more highly protected than other medical records because there's so much stigma still in our society around addiction. That's the protection for people to be able to come in and talk to me who don't want other people to know about their addiction. So it's really stringent privacy laws, and in some ways that's amazing and really protects people and gives them a safe place like Connections where they can come and get the help that they need. And in situations like Brenda, I think was her name, it makes it really challenging for parents. If Brenda would like some support, I highly recommend the Parent Addiction Network. It's an amazing resource for parents in our community, and there's a lot of parents who have been through the same experience as Brenda, who have been trying to do everything in their power to help their son or daughter. And they came together to really support one another. So it's a good place to start.
Is that local or is that a national group? Parents Addiction Network?
That's a local group. So a group of parents in Madison got frustrated with how hard it was to get their kids into treatment, came together through Safe Communities, Stop the Opiate Epidemic initiative, and created this amazing group.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't mean to hijack this, Matthew. Do you have more things?
I was glad you joined in.
I was just kind of looking at all the Facebook comments. Kathy wants to know a generic question. I mean, not generic, but not so specific, I guess. I don't know if she meant like when someone does drugs. She just says, what do you think about when you wake up every morning?
Yeah. So, that's such a good question, and that's actually often the way that I describe my whole experience if I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. When I was actively using, I would wake up every morning and I would think, how can I use today? And then my second thought was always, I hate my life. It's really a hard life, and it's a really sad life. And, I am so lucky to be 12 years in recovery, to work at an amazing job that's incredibly rewarding. And I have a wonderful husband and the most beautiful, amazing children that you could ever meet in your whole life. And now I wake up in the morning and the first thing that I think of is I'm happy. I think that's the difference between addiction and recovery.
Oh, that's amazing. Did you say how many kids you have, just out of curiosity?
I have two. A 4-year-old little girl, and then my son will be 2 next Monday. So.
Oh my gosh! So you're super busy then. Anna wanted to know, and maybe you said this, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what's the reason you wanted to try it to begin with? Did you kind of touched on
The
that.
reason that I first used. So, I experimented with other drugs before I used heroin, and I was in an abusive relationship, and my partner was using. And when I found out that he was using, I went to him and said, I'm done. I won't stay with you. It's the drugs or me. And he said, it's you. It'll always be you. But for my last time, please do it with me. And I did. It was the worst mistake I ever made in my life.
Jim wants to know, what can law enforcement do to really make an impact on this problem?
So I've worked on a lot of the advocacy stuff that I've done with law enforcement, and we're lucky in Dane County to have a very progressive law enforcement community. They're really looking to partner with people in recovery and people that are still struggling to try to come up with better options, because so far law enforcement efforts haven't been very effective in treating this problem. Drug court is a really amazing resource. There's good evidence to back it up. We know that it works. So that's a really good start. And the more that law enforcement officers are willing to work with my side of the community, to understand us better and know how to motivate people to get treatment. Law enforcement's called in these tragic, high stress, high tension scenarios. If they know how to talk to people to motivate them for change and where to refer them to get the services that they need to start and to stay in recovery, then we're really heading in the right direction.
What do you think about the Attorney General? It's a pretty comprehensive plan. You call it the STOP plan. What do you think of the STOP plan? And then are you looking for anything else to come into the STOP plan?
So I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I'll have to take a look at it. So I worked with Brad in the Good Samaritan Committee, and I'm excited to see where he goes with all of this. I think that Representative Nygren's really moved us along beautifully in this state in the right direction. So I'm hopeful that things keep going the direction that they're going now.
Have you ever heard a lawmaker talk about going after the insurance companies to make your job easier?
I haven't. There are some insurers in our area that are really wonderful and I really enjoy working with, but it does seem like a really complicated system.
Anything showing up on Facebook, Michelle?
No, I was just looking through I was going on YouTube right now to see if there were any other links on YouTube, because we've kind of got them everywhere,
Yeah.
But I will say, we can wrap up here because we're almost to 11 o'clock. Mary says a big thank you to those who were strong and vulnerable enough to be aired. Telling your stories, stay strong. A lot of people like that comment.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are supportive and they realize how real it is. Mm-hmm. And hopefully if you are a parent out there and you don't think it can happen in your family or something, that maybe this was eye-opening, because it was definitely, it was definitely educational. I thought at 10.
Good.
And you said to me too when we were having our long talk, 3 deaths in 2000. We saw 40, the most recent numbers we have, in 2013. And you said it was going to get bad, but you see it getting better. And so maybe a way to end is, why do you see it getting better?
So, we've done so much work, and things are, we're starting to use evidence as the basis for our drug policies instead of hyperbole. And that alone really moves us in the right direction. We know things that work, right? We know treatments that work. We know law enforcement strategies that work. Like, we have the evidence to do things in a more effective way than the way that we have been doing them. And now that we have that evidence, and now that we have the first ever person in recovery that's holding the office in the National Drug Control Policy, like federally, a person in recovery is in that spot for the first time ever, right? We've laid the groundwork, we're moving in the right direction, and being in Dane County, I feel like, we have become a national model for how to bring a community together to face this problem.
Well, Skye, thanks for taking so much time for us.
Yeah, happy to.
And that group was just really amazing for letting us in and observing you guys just as you would be if it were a normal day. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much. You guys have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.